So thank you everyone for coming to our penultimate seminar for this term, which is being held in collaboration with the Centre for Extended Archaeology and Heritage. Our speakers today are Helen Frowe and Derek Matravers. Helen Frowe is Professor of Practical Philosophy and Knut and Wallenberg scholar at Stockholm University, where she directs the Stockholm Centre for the Ethics of War and Peace. And Derek Matravers is Professor of Philosophy at the Open University and a Fellow of Churchill College at Cambridge. Their talk today is titled Stones and Lives, the Ethics of Protecting Heritage in War. And without further ado, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation and for organising. We're both really pleased to be here. It's really nice to have a chance to talk about our work with you. Sorry? Oh, mic's here. Oh, can you hear me all right?
You might need to.
Oh, sorry. Actually, hold it. Okay, all right. So, as many of you will probably recall, back in July 2008, we saw images of rampaging looters ransacking the Mosul Museum in Baghdad in Iraq, stealing and destroying thousands of priceless artifacts. And the resultant outrage was directed not just at the looters themselves, but of course also at the failure of the United States and the United Kingdom to prevent, or the armed forces that they had in place at the time, to prevent what archaeologists described as a global catastrophe for world culture. And then in another widely criticized incident, US troops set up camp on the site of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, causing significant damage to the site in an attempt to render it fit for military purposes. And then in 2012, a group that was linked to Al-Qaeda destroyed ancient mausoleums in Timbuktu, triggering what would eventually become the International Criminal Court's first prosecution of the destruction of cultural heritage as a war crime. As you probably also remember, by 2017, ISIS was making headlines around the world for its destruction of renowned cultural heritage sites across Iraq, Syria, and Libya. Groups that were affiliated with ISIS were releasing videos that showed devastating attacks on, for example, the ancient site of Palmyra and Nimrod, and the widespread destruction of artifacts, again, in the Mosul Museum. There were also reports that terrorist groups were drawing funding from the organized looting of archaeological sites. And so the resultant calls for action ranged from pleas for training for locals who were trying to protect these threatened heritage sites to demands that military forces be deployed in order to guard important sites and expel ISIS fighters from areas that were rich in tangible heritage. They also included renewed calls that states that hadn't yet done so ratify UNESCO's Hague Convention on the protection of cultural property in times of armed conflict, which is the principal source of international law governing the fate of heritage in war zones. So the convention obliges states to take protective measures towards their own heritage sites and artifacts, to protect the heritage in occupied territory, and also to limit the use and the damaging of heritage sites by their combatants during war. Now, these obligations raise difficult questions about how we ought to weigh the value of protecting heritage against risks to persons. So in this respect, the laws of war have really significantly outpaced work in the ethics of war. So even though there's been a huge expansion since the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan of work by philosophers on what's normally known as just war theory, hardly anything has been written on the moral status of heritage in war. And this is particularly worrying, we think, because lots of states have already signed up to the Hague Convention and have been signatories for decades. And so they and their combatants are already subject to these legal obligations. Now, when the UK ratified the convention in 2017 in the wake of ISIS's attacks in the Middle East, this was hailed by campaigners as wonderful news that showed that the UK was finally taking the protection of cultural properties in the event of armed conflict seriously. Now, in our recent book, we suggest that, in fact, the moral constraints on endangering both civilians and combatants significantly limit what the Hague Convention and any other military heritage protection policy may require of combatants. So part of the tragedy of threats to heritage in war, we argue, is that it's often morally wrong to order combatants to protect heritage, given the risks of harm that such protection would impose on persons. Now, so ISIS's campaign across the Middle East extended far beyond attacks on heritage. So our newspapers and screens, of course, were filled with images, not just of demolished temples and statues and museums, but also of dead bodies, devastated cities, thousands of refugees fleeing the conflict. And this juxtaposition caused something of a backlash against those who were voicing their concerns about the destruction of ancient ruins. So in the face of this level of human suffering, it can seem sort of inappropriate in some sense to worry about anything other than just the very urgent basic needs of people. So this kind of criticism has been popularly summarized as a dispute about stones versus lives. And this is a dispute that was reignited a few years ago after the fire at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. So in the weeks after the fire, there was an estimated $1 billion raised to rebuild the damaged cathedral. And critics argued that that money would be better spent addressing the very pressing and unmet human needs rooted in the widespread poverty and homelessness that exists across Paris and, of course, around the world. Now, by way of response, advocates for heritage protection are keen to stress that protecting cultural heritage, including meeting the obligations that are laid out in the Hague Convention, don't undermine the protection of human life. So almost invariably, they defend this claim by invoking a thesis that we'll call the inseparability thesis. So according to this thesis, protecting people is just inseparable from protecting heritage, and thus conflicts between them are impossible. So, for example, writing in her capacity as Director General of UNESCO, Irina Bokova asserts that in modern conflicts, there is no need to choose between saving lives and preserving cultural heritage. The two are inseparable. And elsewhere, she writes, "Here at UNESCO, we believe there is no choice to be made between saving lives and saving cultural heritage." In an address to the UN General Assembly, James Cuno, who was at the time president of the J. Paul Getty Institute, remarked that we have all heard the argument that the protection of human life is more important than the preservation of cultural heritage, and that we shouldn't give attention to the latter until we have secured the former. This is a false dichotomy, a false choice. Cultural heritage is completely intertwined with the survival of a people. And finally, Thomas Weiss and Nina Connolly argue that the protection of people and the protection of heritage are conceptually and operationally inseparable. Now, we should be careful not to mistake the inseparability thesis for the much weaker and more plausible claim that heritage is often good for people. So it's true that people often have an interest in heritage and that protecting heritage will protect that interest. So in our view, the moral significant heritage lies precisely in its contribution to human flourishing, that is, in its being good for people. But protecting heritage sometimes conflicts with people's other interests, that is, other things that are good for people, including their interest in staying alive. So taken on its own, the weaker claim that heritage is often good for people offers no guidance at all about how to proceed in the face of conflicts between these different interests and the things that we might need to do to protect them. The staying alive is also good for people. So the challenge of in this weaker claim, or this weaker way of understanding the inseparability thesis, is really no response at all to the stones versus life challenge. So that challenge isn't grounded in the claim that heritage isn't good for people. It's grounded in the claim that protecting heritage can come at the expense of other interests, including protecting lives. And it's that claim that the inseparability thesis denies. So as the quotes just given indicate, this inseparability thesis has many very prominent and influential defenders. And we suspect that it's largely because of the popularity of this thesis amongst heritage professionals that the risks that heritage protection can pose to persons have really evaded moral scrutiny for so long.
Despite its influence, the inseparability thesis is profoundly, indeed obviously, mistaken. So conflicts between protecting heritage and protecting people are rife, both within war and without. So they're revealed in debates about the distribution of scarce resources, in calls for military intervention to protect cultural heritage from attack, and in the Hague Convention itself. The convention allows, for example, that combatants may intentionally damage cultural heritage if military success demands it. However, there's an important caveat. This damage is only allowed if there's no feasible alternative for obtaining a similar military advantage. They must take all feasible precautions to avoid collaterally damaging cultural property, and any collateral damage caused must not be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. And they must also, to the maximum extent feasible, restrain from placing military objectives near cultural property. So these notions of feasibility and excessive damage are moralized notions in the sense that they require weighing things of moral significance against each other, making trade-offs between them. So by way of illustration, imagine two courses of action. Offensive A and offensive B. These have roughly equal chances of achieving the same military objective, and that there are no other courses of action that can achieve that objective. Now, suppose that offensive A is very likely to kill 2 civilians, and offensive B is very likely to kill 1 civilian. Judging what the convention calls feasibility is straightforward in this case, because the death of 2 civilians is clearly morally worse than the death of 1. The availability of offensive B presents a feasible alternative to offensive A. That means that offensive A is just off the table. This is true even if killing 2 civilians would not be excessive given the value of the anticipated military advantage. Feasibility is not about how the deaths compare to the value of the military objective, but rather how the possible means of achieving the objective compare with each other. And since A and B are the only available means of achieving the objective, and B is clearly the least harmful of those means, there's no feasible alternative to B for achieving the advantage. So risking the 1 civilian's life thus satisfies the feasibility condition. So that's all clear, but it's much less clear how one ought to incorporate damage to heritage sites into feasibility calculations. So suppose, for example, that offensive B is very likely not only to kill 1 civilian, but also to damage some ancient ruins, whereas offensive A avoids the ruins entirely, but recall is very likely to kill 2 civilians. Is it better to pursue offensive B? Or is offensive A now a feasible alternative to offensive B, given the risk that offensive B poses to cultural heritage? What if offensive A risks not the lives of civilians, but rather the lives of one's combatants? Similar problems arise with respect to the notion of excessive damage, or proportionality, as it's more widely known. How combatants are to judge, for example, whether the predicted damage to a heritage site is excessive compared to an anticipated military advantage, bearing in mind that in a justified war, military advantages are often intended ultimately as a means of saving lives. Now, the Hague Convention, which governs all this, provides no guidance on these matters. Yet to have any significant impact on the protection of heritage in war, the Hague Convention and any other heritage protection policy must demand that some increase in risk to mission and persons is accepted for the sake of decreasing risk to heritage. So how might we justify this risky heritage protection? Now let's start by distinguishing between instrumental justifications for risky heritage protection and justifications grounded in the value of heritage for its own right. So we can think of various instrumental reasons to protect heritage. So, for example, it's often said that damaging heritage will make it harder for belligerents to win wars. because damage will alienate local people, leading to a lack of cooperation that undermines military objectives. Here, the reasons to protect heritage are grounded not in the value of the heritage itself, but rather in the predicted bad consequences of failing to protect it and the impact on military success. So protecting heritage becomes part of the strategy to win hearts and minds, as the military put it. Or consider a case in which an attack on an important mosque in occupied territory will be a flashpoint for a riot. When a commander orders combatants to guard the mosque, the risks to the combatants' safety are justified not by the value of the mosque, but rather by the value of preventing the riot, and so preventing harms to persons. But we're going to set instrumental justifications for heritage protection aside, because the Hague Convention is not motivated by these kinds of justifications. It's not intended to help states win wars, for example. On the contrary, it places obstacles on the path of military success, prohibiting the damage of cultural heritage, even when this would promote or secure military goals. The Hague Convention is motivated and shaped by the belief that we ought to protect heritage for its own sake. That is, because of its intrinsic value as heritage. And likewise, an account of the ethics of protecting heritage in war should be grounded in the intrinsic value of heritage rather than the instrumental capacities of heritage protection. Insofar as alternative approaches are grounded in, for example, claims about winning wars, preventing genocide, or thwarting terrorism, they are only superficially accounts of the ethics of heritage protection. The real moral work on these accounts is done by the value of the further good that heritage protection is intended to secure. Now, there is, of course, a lot to be said about when and why heritage is valuable, and more specifically, when that value is morally significant. We're not going to say much about that today. Instead, we're just going to assume that heritage is morally valuable when and insofar as it contributes to people living flourishing lives. We're also going to assume that it's permitted to impose at least some risk on people for the sake of protecting heritage. After all, many of our daily activities, such as playing football in the park, driving to the hairdresser, and walking the dog, impose non-consensual risks of serious harm on other people. A football might hit someone in the head or knock them off their bike, perhaps in the path of a passing car. One might crash into someone whilst driving. A dog might attack a child. If we're permitted to impose risks of serious harm for the sake of these fairly trivial goods, then we're surely permitted to impose some risks for the sake of protecting heritage. So this means that we cannot plausibly respond to the conflicts between risks to persons and protecting heritage by arguing that risky heritage protection is never morally permitted, because sometimes we do impose these risks. However, we also believe that we may impose only fairly low risks of serious harm on others for the sake of protecting heritage. For example, imagine that a fire engine... Back. Thank you. For example... I'm glad someone's watching. For example, imagine that a fire engine speeding to Notre Dame Cathedral poses a 50% chance of killing a pedestrian, Anna, en route. Now, intuitively, risk imposition seems intuitively, such risk imposition seems unjustified, assuming that the fire itself threatens nobody's life. After all, it would plausibly be wrong to knowingly leave Anna where she has a 50% chance of dying in the fire in order to concentrate on preventing damage to the cathedral. We would strongly object to firefighters ignoring human casualties in order to protect the building. If so, and if, as most people believe, killing a person is harder to justify than failing to save her, then taking a 50% chance of killing Anna on the way to the cathedral must also be wrong. This is true even though Notre Dame's arguably very valuable heritage, revered by Catholics and others the world over, as evidenced by the flood of funds offered for its restoration.
Oops, sorry. So those are some thoughts about sort of risk imposition in general for the sake of protecting heritage. And of course, outside of war, heritage protection usually imposes only pretty small risks of harm on bystanders, certainly small risks of serious harm. So we might have cases in which we've got firefighters speeding to burning buildings, but they do so only when the risks of hitting pedestrians are pretty small. They do everything they can to minimize those risks. They train specifically to do so, and so on. Now, within war, of course, the stakes are typically much higher. So it's just the nature of wartime military operations that they involve significant risks of very serious harm. So this is just primarily a result of the nature of military weapons. So the bulk of the military arsenal is just designed and used in order to cause lethal harm. So this means that collateral harms are very often lethal as well. In lots of wars, as many of you probably know, civilians just make up the vast majority of the casualties. It's also because injuries that wouldn't really be serious outside of war can often become very serious very quickly during the conditions of armed conflict. So the fact that there's a lack of infrastructure and resources just significantly increases the chances of, say, dying from an infection. So a broken bone can very easily become a permanent disability. More generally, war is just very unpredictable. It takes place in territory and terrain that's unfamiliar or dangerous or both, and under conditions of extreme pressure and uncertainty. So all of this means that military activity in or close to populated areas typically poses a significant risk of civilians suffering very serious harm. Given, for example, say just the risk of something like the presence of combatants attracting enemy fire, right? So that if someone's caught in the crossfire, the kind of harm that that civilian's going to suffer is likely to be a very serious harm. There's also risks about, say, collaterally damaging civilian homes and their infrastructure, of mistaking civilians for combatants. That's very common in particular types of warfare. And of course, just collaterally killing and injuring civilians themselves. All of those people who are displaced by nearby military activity also face the risks that attach to being a refugee, which of course include things like prolonged homelessness, disease, malnutrition, and exploitation. So now think about a fairly simple case in which a military unit faces damaging cultural heritage. Now suppose that it's just like really militarily important that the unit travel to a particular location in order, say, to destroy a vital supply line, and that's going to be a really important turning point in the war. And so suppose that they've got two possible routes. So route A takes them through an archaeological site, and route B is going to take them through a densely populated town. So clearly in this case, the combatants need to weigh up the risks of each route. And as we've just seen, traveling through the populated area, if they take route B, might well impose at least moderate risks of serious harm on the civilians. Excuse me. Now, if they do this in order to avoid the archaeological site, then the combatants are imposing these risks on the civilians for the sake of protecting the heritage. And unlike our Notre Dame case, where the firefighters risk killing just one person, the combatants who are traveling through this densely populated area expose many people to risks of serious harm. Now, if it's true, as we've suggested, that it would be wrong to significantly endanger just one person's life in order to save Notre Dame Cathedral, then this implies that it would be wrong for the combatants in this case to endanger the civilians in order to protect the archaeological site. Now, of course, some people might disagree with our verdict in the Notre Dame case, right? So they might think that it's permissible to take a higher chance of killing Anna in order to save the cathedral. But the mere fact that we believe many people would at least find this to be a difficult case in which it's not obvious whether or not it's permissible to risk killing Anna strongly suggests that even if the fire engine, driving the fire engine is in fact permissible in this case, the threshold for impermissibility is not far away, right? So if this is a difficult case, we're a bit unsure, just make it 2 people, or just make it an 80% chance of killing Anna. The broader and more important point for our purposes is that our intuitions about risk imposition outside of war suggest that in most cases, it will be wrong for combatants to decrease risks to heritage at the expense of increasing risks to civilians, given that the nature of war means that the risks that are imposed by combatants are often risks of very serious harm that imperil many people. So, on our view, then, the wrongness of imposing risks on civilians is one moral constraint on protecting heritage in war. Now, another is the wrongness of ordering combatants to incur risks themselves in order to protect heritage. So there are various ways in which protecting heritage can endanger combatants. So the Hague Convention, for example, requires that occupying forces preserve the cultural heritage in the territory that they control. So this kind of risk-taking is exemplified in the first image here in a case from 2003, in which US combatants retrieved Jewish archival material from the basement of the Iraqi intelligence headquarters. So the headquarters were already unstable because they've been bombed, and they were located next to a bunch of unexploded artillery. And the bombing had also damaged the building's water system, which had caused the basement to flood with raw sewage. So this is the guys here, they're descending into the basement, and all of this is just filthy water, just kind of full of raw sewage. So retrieving this material exposed these combatants to a range of threats. One later described becoming as sick as I'd ever been in my life after being splashed by the contaminated water during the operation. Combatants can also be required to guard cultural buildings and archaeological sites against looters or from attack. And obviously this also exposes them to the risk of harm from those people who are wanting to attack the sites. Combatants can also be required to incur risks to avoid damaging heritage themselves. So the Hague Convention requires that combatants take all feasible precautions in the choice of means and methods of attack with a view to avoiding and in any event minimizing incidental damage to cultural property. So some of these precautions that the combatants are required to take to minimize the risk to the heritage sites increase the risk to the combatants. And again, the convention itself just offers no guidance about how combatants are required to balance these risks between making things more dangerous for them and making it safer for the heritage. So the famous case is the targeting of insurgency headquarters in Mali in 2013. So the insurgents had set up their headquarters in a house that was adjacent to a World Heritage Site mosque. Now, the government forces had originally planned to airstrike in order to target the insurgents, but they decided that that was going to be too risky in terms of collaterally damaging the mosque. And so they decided to have a ground offensive instead. So they used ground artillery, and that meant that they could destroy the headquarters without damage to the mosque. Now, this case is kind of lauded in the literature as an exemplar of cultural property protection in action. So UNESCO described this as an instance of best practice. But the archaeologist and US Army advisor on cultural heritage protection is a woman called Laurie Rush, argues that clearly this success placed the artillery crew at much greater risk. In general, she notes that combatants may need to assume additional risk in order to remove a target that's been deliberately placed near a cultural site or feature, right? So it's not an accident. We can think that this is where the headquarters is. It's done deliberately. Now, again, we can grant that we have duties to protect and to avoid damaging heritage, but we doubt that that people can be required to incur significant risks to themselves for the sake of protecting heritage. So, for example, imagine that our unfortunate bystander who's hanging out near Notre Dame Cathedral on the day of the fire, imagine that Anna could douse the flames and save the cathedral, but only at a high risk of incurring really serious burns to her arms. Now, I think that it would be wrong to force a person like Anna or coerce her into enacting such a rescue. And the reason why it's wrong to force a person to incur this kind of risk for the sake of protecting heritage, even when it's very valuable heritage, is that Anna just has no duty to incur this kind of risk for the sake of the cathedral. So it would also be wrong, for example, for a police officer to order Anna to incur this kind of risk, even if in general we agree that police officers are sometimes permitted to give orders to members of the public. Actions that incur this kind of risk are what we philosophers call supererogatory, right? They go beyond what morality requires of us, which means that it's wrong for third parties to force or order somebody else to incur that kind of risk. Now, likewise, imagine that Anna could avoid being burnt by the fire only by smothering the flames with a handy bit of the Bayeux tapestry. Now, perhaps we're required to suffer somewhat greater harm to avoid damaging heritage rather than to save it, right? So this is a distinction between causing harm and allowing harm. But we still doubt that a person could be required to let herself suffer really serious burns rather than damage a tapestry. It would, I think, clearly be wrong to try to prevent Anna from shielding herself from the fire with the tapestry, pulling the tapestry out of her hands and exposing her to the flames. So this gives us at least prima facie reason to think that it's wrong to order combatants to incur even moderate risks for the sake of protecting heritage.
Now, of course, combatants routinely incur risks that ordinary citizens are not obliged to incur. We usually justify this by saying that the combatants have consented to incur these risks. But it's doubtful that combatants have consented to incur ordinarily supererogatory risks for the sake of heritage. And this is partly because there's good reason to doubt that many combatants issue valid, that is, free and informed consent to any of the risks of combat. In general, the higher the stakes of an activity, the higher the bar for valid consent. The bar is sensitive to two components of consent: the agent's cognitive capacity and the quality of the information she has on which to base her decision. Now, it's widely accepted that consenting to higher stakes activities requires a higher degree of cognitive capacity. This can justify legal limits on the kinds of activities to which someone with a significant cognitive impairment can consent. So, for example, a person with advanced dementia might have the capacity to consent to a blood test or a haircut, but lack the capacity to consent to marriage or sexual activity. Now, higher stakes activities also set a higher informational standard. A person who lacks adequate information cannot ordinarily give valid consent to a high stakes activity, at least when that activity is not one from which she can expect to derive a benefit. Now, this latter clause about expecting to derive a benefit explains, for example, why we may carry out risky but urgent surgery on a patient who has only limited information about the risks or lacks full cognitive capacity. Imperfect consent of this sort, or even presumed consent, can be sufficient to justify endangering a person when we do so for her own sake. But we cannot justify the risks that combatants are ordered to incur in combat. We do not endanger combatants for their own sake, but rather as a means of achieving goods for others. Thus, the higher informational standard for valid consent applies, given that serving as a combatant is a high-stakes activity. But even a cursory look at the recruitment of combatants gives us reason to doubt that most issue valid consent to any of the risks of combat. In many countries, including many Western democracies, combatants are manipulated and misled during recruitment drives. A report commissioned by Joseph Rowntree, the Joseph Rowntree Trust, found that the British Army's recruitment literature, quotes, never mentions the risk of being killed, seriously injured, or chronically traumatized. Indeed, the word risk appeared only once across all the reviewed literature sent to potential recruits and their parents. That risk is immediately trivialized, couched in a clearly false assertion that, quotes, everyone sent on operations is fully equipped with the skills and knowledge required to handle any situation. The report remarks that these recruitment materials give, quotes, the impression that army jobs have little connection with warfare. This is despite the UK government's requirement that recruitment aimed at under 18s should include, quotes, clear and precise explanation of the duties involved in military service. And of course, there's no reason why this requirement should be limited to the recruitment of under 18s. So it's hard to see how these materials could enable a recruit to give informed consent to the risks of combat. Now, armed forces are also disproportionately made up of those from poorer backgrounds, with overrepresentation of minority and disadvantaged groups, who are routinely targeted by recruitment drives. Many people enlist only because they lack other opportunities for employment and education, which challenges the idea that their consent is freely given. So these concerns are exacerbated by the educational background of recruits, which bears directly on their ability to understand both their enlistment contracts and, of course, the laws of armed conflict that will apply to them if they do enlist. So, for example, in 2013, 39% of all British Army personnel had the reading ability of an 11-year-old or younger. Between 2016 and 2019, 50 recruits had a reading age between 5 and 7. In 2018, over a quarter of recruits were children. And these problems are replicated across other armed forces. Now, these concerns support quite general skepticism about whether enlistees consent to the risks of combat. There's also specific reason to doubt that enlistees consent to incur risks for the sake of heritage. Part of consents being informed is that the agent knows what she is consenting to, which includes knowing the purposes for which risks might be imposed upon her. Yet combatants are rarely told that they might be ordered to incur risks for the sake of heritage. Current members of armed forces often receive little or no cultural property protection training. A series of 2014 studies involving US military personnel found that, quotes, the vast majority of participants had no experience of cultural protection training, cultural heritage training, and are, quotes, less than somewhat aware of laws and protection. Moreover, any training provided tends to present heritage protection solely as a force multiplier, as they say, that can save combatants' lives and increase their chances of military success. So it focuses, for example, on how respecting heritage can improve local relations, thereby decreasing hostility and the chances of reprisal attacks. And there's little evidence that recruits to the armed forces are told prior to enlistment that they might in fact be asked to risk their lives, or indeed civilians' lives, in order to protect heritage sites and artifacts. Now, someone might claim that, might grant the claim that combatants do not specifically consent to being endangered for the sake of heritage. However, they might insist that combatants are a special case who issue a kind of open consent to being endangered to any degree for whatever reason their commanding officers or political leaders deem appropriate. So you sign up and you just sort of, you're in the process of signing up, you give this open consent to do whatever it is that you're ordered to do. Now, this is doubtful both by the standards of common sense morality and as evidenced by, for example, the controversies over the use of combatants for medical research, the administration to combatants of drugs that have not been approved for general use, and ordering combatants to engage in humanitarian interventions to protect the interests of non-citizens. Though all those are controversial, they wouldn't be if combatants issued open consent. Now, we suggest that when it comes to risks of at least serious harm, one cannot give open consent. That is, one cannot simply consent to whatever risks to which one might be exposed. This is why someone participating in a medical trial, for example, must be informed of the specific risks involved for her consent to count as valid. She cannot simply issue a blanket waiver of her rights, consenting to be harmed to any degree for any medical purpose. Similarly, since the risks of combat are risks of serious harm, those enlisting in the armed forces cannot issue a blanket waiver of their rights. An enlistee cannot give open consent to be endangered for the sake of the national interest or in defense of our values. These descriptions are too vague to satisfy any plausibly robust standard of information that could validate consent to supererogatory risks of serious harm. The fact that existing military recruitment practices are vague about the reasons why a combatant might be asked to risk her life should not mislead us into thinking that states are not morally required to provide such information. On the contrary, states should provide much more information to combatants about the ends to which they might be asked to serve and the reasons for which they might be endangered. We can understand, of course, why states are so reluctant to provide this information. Presumably, greater transparency is more likely to discourage than encourage enlistment. But the fact that a person would withhold her consent were she given more information can hardly serve as a justification for withholding that information. On the contrary, the withholding or misrepresentation of relevant information plausibly invalidates consent in a range of cases. If combatants have not been informed that they might be ordered to incur risks for the sake of heritage, then they do not consent to incur these risks. And if they've not consented, it's impermissible to order them to incur them.
So one of the sort of conclusions of our book is that important not to underestimate the force or the sort of the scale of these kinds of problems with combatant consent or lack thereof. So our argument suggests that many, perhaps most, combatants that are currently enlisted in the armed forces worldwide haven't consented to incur supererogatory risks for the sake of heritage, and therefore they may not be ordered to incur these kinds of risks. And this makes implementing the Hague Convention or any other kind of military policy of heritage protection really deeply morally problematic. Now, if they're to constrain fighting in any significant way, then these laws and these policies will need to require that combatants incur what would normally be supererogatory risks for the sake of heritage, right? So these sort of policies and laws, there's only any point to them if they change the way in which combatants behave, if they change the kinds of orders that combatants are given. But if what we argue is sound, then it's morally impermissible to order many or most combatants to incur these kinds of risks for the sake of protecting heritage. Now, these problems could be rectified by, say, improving the recruitment process for the armed forces. So, I mean, this seems, given the sort of, as we referred to, given the sort of general state of military recruitment policies, this seems like something that's already fairly urgently demanded on multiple grounds. But it's also possible that consent, for example, could be obtained from specific combatants after they enlist for specific operations that involve heritage protection. So, like the Monuments Men is like the most famous example of this sort of volunteer force who specifically consent to incur risks for the sake of heritage. And lots of armed forces do rely on volunteer forces for specific duties. So, for example, the UK only uses volunteers for staffing its submarines. Norway will only use volunteers for UN peacekeeping missions. So Laurie Rush notes in some of her work with a kind of a bit of an air of regret that cultural property protection in the US armed forces has been sort of relegated to voluntary additional duty status. But our account suggests that far from being a matter for regret, actually it's only volunteers who should be incurring these kinds of risks. And as we've also suggested, the moral constraints on endangering civilians also pose a really significant challenge to implementing heritage protection policies in war. So although we didn't talk about it here, but in the book we argue that it's even more unlikely with respect to civilians that these challenges can be overcome by appealing to consent, partly just for practical problems, right? It's really hard to get consent from a civilian population for something like being endangered for the sake of heritage protection. So these problems with the Hague Convention manifest not only in the way that it demands exposing people to risk, but also just in its failure to offer any guidance about how to balance these risks. So it sort of sets these obligations and puts them into law, but there's no explanation of how anybody's supposed to implement any of these obligations. Now, if we're to respond properly to the demands that there are for the protection of heritage in war, we have to recognize not just that there are conflicts between protecting heritage and risks to people, but also draw, we suggest, on the broader resources that are available in moral and political philosophy to really make progress on understanding how we can compare these different types of risks and harms against each other. And we should be open to the idea that even though, of course, there's a really strong intuitive appeal to the idea that we ought to protect heritage in war, we should be open to the idea that actually it might sometimes be morally impermissible to do this in light of the risks that heritage protection can pose to persons. Thank you very much.
We have a slight issue with the lapel mic, so I will instead get my step count up and go to and from the audience with the questions. So this is the time, online audience in person. If anyone has any questions, please do.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk. I found it really stimulating and very interesting. And it is interesting at the moment, given the geopolitical situation. In the last few months, I've noticed a few articles in the press about the breakdown of international law generally, particularly with respect to Trump. So I just wondered whether your thoughts had changed since completing the book in relation to that, but also how this might relate to something like Ulrich and Giddens' Risk Society and the breakdown of over sort of control of the state. And this is not my field at all, but that was in my head while you were talking, so I just thought I'd ask it. Thanks.
So thanks, yeah, and thank you for your kind words about our talk. So your first question was about sort of the general breakdown, whether that's caused us to change our thought. I mean, I think so. One of the objections that people like me who work on the ethics of war and often are sort of the views that I would defend depart quite a lot from the legal position, what international law says about war. And one of the sort of pushbacks you often get is you say, look, international law is like pretty fragile. And so when you engage in this kind of criticism of the laws that we've managed to get some consensus on, you kind of threaten the project of international law by sort of saying, you know, we should revise these laws, or these laws don't seem very morally plausible. And so I can see there is a kind of, the more that we see this sort of threat of erosion of either, you know, we might say of law, or really the adherence to international law, that we might become more cautious about sort of standing up and saying, gosh, you know, some of these laws don't really seem very good. So I don't think it's kind of a special problem about laws regarding heritage protection. I think there's kind of, there can be general worries about sort of the broader consequences of engaging in this kind of criticism of the laws. But I also think it's still really important to do it, because the only way in which we make moral progress is by having an external standard by which we can judge the legislation that we have. And so unless we know what we're aiming for and how things ought to be, you can't have laws kind of in a vacuum that are just freestanding. International law is particularly tricky because, of course, you've got to get consensus from so many people with all these different vested interests. And so what you end up in international law, often much more than in domestic law, is something that's really far apart from the moral standard. Much easier in domestic law to try and revise laws in lines with sort of what we think of as moral progress, right? So revise laws on gay marriage, revise laws on abortion, this kind of thing, as we kind of, you know, move towards what people kind of have reached more of a consensus on what they want their society to look like. Much more difficult when you're trying to get that kind of consensus across, you know, hundreds of states. And so the international law already is kind of in its nature just going to be a lot less morally perfect. But nonetheless, the basic principle I think still applies, that we want to have standards that are independent of the laws themselves, so we understand what it is that we're working towards. So I think even though there's the sort of some risks that can be involved, we should still kind of want to work towards moral progress. And also we should, I mean, certainly as philosophers, be fairly modest about how much, you know, Donald Trump is really listening to, you know, I don't think Donald's read our book. So it's sort of, I mean, I'm sure he needs to, but yeah, so, you know, it's also kind of, you know, the problems don't come from us. I guess that is what I want to say. Derek, you want to?
Well, actually, just some banal thoughts on international law. It is a problem, and of course, the problem is that there's no way of enforcing them. So if big powers decide not to obey international laws, and it's not only in this area but also in another area I'm interested in space law. At the moment, it's a complete catastrophe because international law is just being completely disregarded. But I guess, I mean, the thought is it's still nicer to have. It's a better world where people have signed up to these things and can perhaps one day be held to account for disregarding them, so it's still worth worrying about, I think.
I have another question at the back and then I'll come back to you.
Yeah, I'm a bit of a non-conformist myself.
Yes, it's for the
all right. Yeah, I'm a bit of a non-conformist myself, so, you know, I don't go along with war kind of things like that. But listening to what you're saying, heritage is considered something old. Now, you're talking about protection of old things, yeah? And interesting that you're going back to the young people, these young soldiers, yeah? They're the ones that do the attacking. They're the ones that do the dying. They die to protect the old things. Now, interesting, I found out recently that older people, yeah, older people are much more reactive than younger people. I was very surprised to hear that. Older people are much more reactive than younger people. This is a fact. That means they're far more ready to go to war. Older people. And that means also it's the people who die in war that get sacrificed are the children, whether they're soldiers or children themselves who get attacked and bombed. So heritage, it is old, isn't it? That's what I'm saying. You see, look at these old heritage buildings. They're actually ruins anyway. Oh, I mean, it looks like they've been bombed already. Do you see what I'm saying? And it's the older people that send young people to war all the time, because old people don't like change. They react to it. They don't like change. That's why they like these old heritage things. It represents themselves. It's like it represents them. Do you see what I'm saying? So I just wonder how you react to that.
You need the mic back so people can hear. Thanks so much for the question. So, I mean, part of what Derek and I are trying to do in our work is sort of, really take seriously the fact that war endangers people's lives, and that heritage protection, when it's part of war, can endanger people's lives. So I think maybe that element of our work maybe sort of speaks to what you're gesturing towards, with the idea that we've got a lot of young people being sent out to die, and that, of course, historically, especially given the sort of the tendency for members of the armed forces to come from less affluent groups, sort of socially deprived groups, so less well represented in the political sphere, right? So famously, like, it's not rich people's children going off to fight wars and so on. That gives us that's part of what drives our concern about consent and combatants, and the sort of the way in which the risks of war fighting are distributed amongst various social groups. And so I think we do try and take seriously the idea that sort of war is really costly for the people that fight it. Now, on your point about sort of, is this kind of weird sort of paradox almost, that we've got all this old stuff in and a bunch of young people sent to defend it. I mean, some heritage is old, some of it's not that old, right? So we might think like the Banksy paintings can count as heritage, right? So stuff we knew. Sydney Opera House isn't terribly old, but still wonderful. And loads of it's old, yeah, but it doesn't have to. And I think the point is, its age in itself is not the source of the value, right? So age is often just a kind of contingent feature, but something's not going to be heritage simply because it's old. It's going to have other features as well. And part of what is a sort of thought to be the value of heritage comes from the fact that it's a kind of a value for all members of either humanity or society, and that this is something that's part of the inheritance of the young, right? There's sort of these sources of important value that can enrich their lives. So it's not sort of like this is just young people being sent off to fight for stuff that only old people care about. The thought is that I don't know. I think that would be a particular account of the value of heritage, so it sort of suggests that somehow that value is inaccessible to young people. And I don't know why we would think that that's true. I think lots of young people really engage very valuably. I mean, look at all these people here doing their PhDs. I mean, wars might do that, but are interested in the kind of the moral dimensions. Yeah.
There's a reception after this to continue the conversation.
I think
Yes, there's a few things.
There's a few things online. So had a couple who've had to run off. Isabel Holstein says very interesting, so I had to leave early. Sandra Dudley also says it was really interesting. She did have a question for you, but she's had to scoot. So sorry. And Andrew Nason Williams says, an interesting presentation. Some of my former patients have on becoming adults, had their lives positively transformed by a military career. But what about the duty of care to protect members of the armed services from themselves and from their potential altruism or indeed personal greed in situations where combatants mistakenly believe that there are strong altruistic or personal, financial or other remunerative opportunities, and in those certain circumstances considered by some to be worth a risk?
So this is a case where somebody might be faced with a decision and take a decision for self-interested motives, and so they, I don't know, so they take a big risk upon themselves, in the belief, either true or not, that they might benefit hugely from it. And do we have a duty? And I suppose if you asked a general question of, which this wasn't the question that was asked, but if one did ask a general question of do we have a duty of care to kind of stop people doing those kind of things, and presumably not, because that'd mean there'd be no entrepreneurs who went bankrupt, but or didn't. In the armed services, well, I guess in the armed services, the structure's there to guide people's decisions anyway. So with a bit of luck, that sort of thing, that kind of thing doesn't crop up with combatants, does it?
I think, there is this sort of general question about, when should we try and prevent people from taking risks that are ill-advised? But we tend to be pretty sort of hands-off when it comes to, if people want to go abseiling, or they want to go rock climbing, or they, we let people do risky things simply because they think they'll get a thrill out of it, right? Or they might do things because they make money or do foolish bets, and we don't tend to place too many limits on the ways in which people can sort of pursue their own chosen ends. So whether there's a kind of, I think given the particular risks of combatants, and also that combatants, you have this sort of dual sort of feature of joining the armed forces, is that most people have personal motives, so training, ability to get a qualification, a trade, travel, all the sorts of reasons why somebody might join the armed forces, often also combined with something like wanting to serve their country in some important role. But then also we have to recognize, I think, the fact that combatants are used by the state as a tool. And I think this is the kind of the interesting dimension of this question, is whether, if someone who just goes abseiling for fun isn't being used by the state as a tool. And so we might say there's not the same kind of duty of care. I think when it comes to the combatants and the state, actually, they do probably have a more stringent duty of care to make sure that people, it's not so much that they can't consent for those reasons, but that, as we argue in our work, they really need to understand the risks of what they're consenting to, right? That what this training is in exchange for, or what this salary is in exchange for, or this exciting travel is in exchange for. It's not all glamour, right? And despite the earlier thought, have spoken to a lot of combatants, and many of the people that I've spoken to who served in places like Afghanistan really just found, until they got there, they just had no idea of what this was going to be like. Nothing in their training had prepared them for the reality. And so it's really hard. And because some sense that's kind of inevitable, right? Fighting a war is the kind of thing you can't understand until you do it. Right? It's what philosophers call a sort of transformative experience. But we could do so much better than we do at trying to convey that information of what it's like. At the moment, most armies actively try to present a false picture, right? So this is why we include the stuff about the recruitment literature, where it's just this idea that really you could read this stuff and not understand that your job had anything to do with fighting a war, right? It's just all about training, it's all about travel, it's all about the friends that you will make. And all of this is sold as the package. And so the problem is not so much are people sort of consenting for the wrong reasons, but do they really understand what they're consenting to? I think is what we would try and sort of say and sort of in response to that kind of question.
We will have to, I think, stop there just because of time. However, if people would like to continue the conversation, ask our speakers any questions they may have, there is a wine and juice reception in the foyer of Kathleen Kenyon, which is the building like directly opposite this one. So do please come along and can continue the conversation there. I just want to say a really quick thank you to Bruce and the Centre for helping us host this seminar and for giving us two incredible speakers. Thank you to both our in-person and online audiences. A couple of quick notices for upcoming talks. So next Thursday on the 26th of March, there's the next Museum Studies seminar, which will be Dr. Jamie Larkin from Warwick University talking on more than just selling photographs, museum publication staff and the nature of the museum. And next Wednesday, on the 25th, we will have our final Wednesday seminar of the term, which will be Rob Collins from Newcastle University talking on a very different topic, the phallus and the frontier, the form and function of phallic carvings from Hadrian's Wall. So do come along to that as well. But if for now everyone could just join me in giving one massive thank you to our two incredible speakers.